For 43 years, Margaret kept the secret locked behind her ribs like a bird in a cage. Every Sunday dinner, every holiday photo, every casual conversation about her past, she edited, omitted, rewrote. But when Dorothy's obituary appeared in the newspaper, listing Margaret as merely a close friend, something inside her shattered. At 71 years old, standing in her kitchen with trembling hands and that damning piece of paper, Margaret made a decision that would crack open decades of silence. She would tell the truth. She would speak Dorothy's name the way it deserved to be spoken, not as a footnote, but as the love of her life. This is the story of what happened when one woman decided that hiding was more unbearable than any consequence of truth. The summer of 1962 arrived in Boston with oppressive heat and the promise of change that never quite materialized. Margaret was 28, working as a secretary at a law firm downtown, living in a modest apartment in Back Bay that she shared with two other young women. Her life followed the expected trajectory: church on Sundays, secretarial pool on weekdays, occasional dates with appropriate young men who bored her to tears. Dorothy walked into Filene's department store on a Tuesday afternoon in June, and Margaret's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. She was standing at the cosmetics counter, pretending to be interested in a shade of lipstick she would never buy, when she heard a voice behind her say, "That color would look dreadful on you, darling. Try the rose instead." Margaret turned to find a woman perhaps 5 years older, with dark hair pinned in an elegant chignon, and eyes that seemed to see straight through every pretense Margaret had ever maintained. "Excuse me?" Margaret managed, heat rising to her cheeks. "The coral," Dorothy continued, undeterred, picking up a different tube. "It's all wrong for your complexion. You need something softer. Here." She selected a rose-toned lipstick and held it up to Margaret's face, standing so close that Margaret could smell her perfume. Something expensive and complex, nothing like the simple fragrances the girls in her apartment wore. Margaret should have been offended, should have walked away. Instead, she found herself saying, "Are you always this forward with strangers?" Dorothy's smile was slow and deliberate. "Only with the interesting ones." They had coffee that afternoon at a small cafe 3 blocks away, then dinner the following week, then regular Wednesday meetings that Margaret told her roommates were volunteer work at the library. Dorothy was a buyer for a high-end boutique, traveled to New York regularly, lived alone in an apartment on Beacon Hill that Margaret wouldn't see for another 2 months. The first time Dorothy kissed her, they were standing in Dorothy's kitchen late one evening, rain streaming down the windows, the rest of the world feeling very far away. Margaret had been rambling nervously about something inconsequential when Dorothy simply reached up, placed one hand along her jaw, and kissed her with the kind of certainty that erased every excuse Margaret had been preparing. "I've wanted to do that since the lipstick counter," Dorothy whispered against her mouth. Margaret's response came without thought. "I've wanted you to." That night changed everything. Margaret discovered that all the disconnect she'd felt with men, all the careful performance of interest and enthusiasm, had simply been because she was looking in the wrong direction. With Dorothy, everything made sense. The touch that made her skin come alive, the conversations that lasted until dawn, the way desire felt like coming home rather than an obligation to fulfill. But 1962 Boston was not kind to women like them. They learned quickly to be careful, to never hold hands in public, to introduce each other as friends, roommates, colleagues, anything but what they actually were. Dorothy's apartment became their sanctuary, the only place they could be honest, where Margaret could fall asleep with her head on Dorothy's shoulder without fear. "We'll have to be smart about this," Dorothy said one evening, tracing patterns on Margaret's arm. "The world isn't ready for us yet." "Will it ever be?" Margaret asked. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know, but I know I'm not willing to give this up. Are you?" Margaret kissed her answer into Dorothy's palm, her wrist, the hollow of her throat. No, she would never give this up. Whatever careful dance they had to perform for the world, it would be worth it for these private moments of truth. The years developed their own rhythm, a careful choreography of public distance and private intimacy. Margaret eventually moved into her own studio apartment, close enough to Dorothy's place to walk between them without raising suspicion, far enough to maintain the appearance of separate lives. They became masters of discretion, fluent in the language of plausible deniability. To the outside world, they were simply good friends, close friends. The kind of friends who had dinner together several times a week, who took vacations to Cape Cod or the White Mountains, who spent holidays together when family obligations allowed. Margaret's mother, still alive then, occasionally suggested it was strange that Margaret spent so much time with that Dorothy woman, but she never pressed further. Perhaps she didn't want to know. Perhaps she suspected but found silence easier than confrontation. Dorothy's family was different, wealthy, distant, formal. Her parents had died when she was in her 30s, leaving her a comfortable inheritance that afforded her independence most women of their era never achieved. She had a brother in California whom she barely spoke to, and no one who questioned too closely how she spent her time or with whom. Their life together existed in the margins, the spaces between what they showed the world. Saturday mornings in Dorothy's kitchen, Margaret reading the newspaper aloud while Dorothy made eggs and toast. Sunday afternoons at the Museum of Fine Arts, standing just slightly too close in front of paintings they both loved. Tuesday evenings when Margaret would stay late after dinner, and late would stretch into midnight, into dawn, into Margaret calling her office with a believable excuse about a stomach bug. They were careful, always so careful. They learned which restaurants were safe, which neighborhoods allowed two women to walk together without comment, which friends could be trusted with proximity to the truth even if they never spoke it aloud. There were others like them, other women who understood the code, who hosted discreet gatherings in their apartments where everyone could breathe freely for a few hours. Margaret remembered one such evening, in someone's Brookline apartment, watching Dorothy across the room laughing with another woman, completely relaxed in a way she never was in public. The sight made Margaret's chest ache with love and anger in equal measure. Love for Dorothy, anger at a world that forced them to hide something so beautiful. "It's not fair," she'd whispered to Dorothy later that night, wrapped together in Dorothy's bed. "No," Dorothy agreed, her fingers threading through Margaret's hair. "It's not, but it's what we have, and what we have, Margaret, is worth everything." The decades passed in this strange duality. Margaret advanced in her career, eventually becoming an executive assistant at a prestigious firm. Dorothy's boutique thrived. They bought a small cottage together on the coast of Maine, listed in Dorothy's name alone, purchased with money from both of them, where they spent summers and long weekends pretending they were the only two people in the world. They had arguments, as any couple does, about money, about Margaret's fear of discovery, about Dorothy's occasional recklessness. Once Dorothy had squeezed Margaret's hand under a restaurant table, and Margaret had pulled away sharply, terrified someone had seen. They'd fought about it for 3 days. "I'm not ashamed of you," Margaret had finally said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not ashamed of us. I'm just afraid." "I know," Dorothy had replied, pulling her close. "I'm afraid too, but I won't let fear make me pretend you're nothing to me." They compromised, as they always did, careful but present, hidden but together. By the time they reached their 60s, they'd built a comfortable life within their constraints. They'd weathered the AIDS crisis, watching from the sidelines as a different part of their community suffered and organized and fought back. They'd seen the world begin to change, slowly, incrementally. Young people were starting to come out to demand recognition. But for Margaret and Dorothy, the patterns were too deeply set. They'd spent 40 years being careful. They couldn't imagine any other way. Dorothy's diagnosis came on a Tuesday in November, 3 weeks after her 71st birthday. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctor delivered the news with clinical sympathy, mentioning time frames and treatment options that all amounted to the same thing: months, not years. Margaret sat in the waiting room during that appointment, listed as emergency contact, because there was no other category that captured what she actually was. When Dorothy emerged, pale but composed, Margaret knew immediately. She'd always been able to read Dorothy's face, every tiny shift in expression. They drove home in silence. Dorothy stared out the window at the gray November landscape, her hand resting on the seat between them where Margaret couldn't take it. Only when they were safely inside Dorothy's apartment, their apartment, really, though Margaret still maintained her own place for appearances, did Dorothy finally speak. 6 months, maybe less. Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her. 6 months. After 43 years, they had 6 months left. The weeks that followed were a surreal blend of medical appointments, difficult treatments, and the terrible weight of secrets. Dorothy's brother flew in from California, suddenly interested in his sister's life after decades of distance. Friends from church came by with casseroles and concern. Everyone wanted to help, to support poor Dorothy through her illness. And Margaret had to smile and accept their designation as Dorothy's good friend. Had to sit in hospital waiting rooms reading magazines while Dorothy's brother went back for tests, because family was allowed and friends were not. Had to bite her tongue when nurses asked if Dorothy had someone to care for her at home, and Margaret couldn't say, "Yes, me, the person who has loved her for 43 years. Dorothy grew weaker. By January, she'd moved into hospice care at a facility in Brookline. Margaret visited every day, sometimes sitting for hours beside Dorothy's bed, holding her hand when no one else was in the room, releasing it quickly when footsteps approached in the hallway. One afternoon, when Dorothy was having a rare moment of clarity through the pain medication, she squeezed Margaret's hand and said, "I need you to promise me something." "Anything," Margaret whispered. "Don't let them erase me from your life. After. Don't let them pretend I was just your friend." Margaret's throat closed. "Dorothy, promise me. I don't care anymore what people think. I'm dying anyway, but you have to keep living. And I can't bear the thought of you spending the rest of your life hiding what we were." "I promise," Margaret said, though she had no idea how she would keep it. Dorothy died on a Wednesday morning in February. Margaret was there, had been there all night, dozing in the chair beside the bed. Dorothy's brother had gone home hours earlier to sleep. In the quiet dark of the hospice room, with only the sound of machinery and Dorothy's labored breathing, Margaret climbed carefully into the narrow bed and held Dorothy close. "I love you," she whispered into Dorothy's hair. "I have loved you every single day for 43 years, and I will love you for every day I have left." Dorothy's breathing changed, grew shallower, then stopped. Margaret held her as the sun came up, held her until the nurses came to check, held her until Dorothy's brother arrived, and Margaret had to step back, had to become the friend again, had to watch from the corner while he made phone calls and arrangements, playing the role of chief mourner. The obituary was the final insult. Margaret read it 3 days later, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee growing cold in front of her. The brief paragraph detailed Dorothy's career, her charitable work, her surviving brother. At the end, a single line. "Dorothy is also survived by many friends, including her close companion, Margaret Harrison." Close companion. 43 years reduced to 2 sanitized words. Margaret sat there for a long time, something hardening inside her chest. She thought about Dorothy's final request. She thought about the thousands of small erasures they'd endured, the ways they'd been forced to diminish themselves. She thought about what it had cost them, the family gatherings where they couldn't arrive together, the hospital rooms where Margaret had no standing, the legal documents where they couldn't name each other as beneficiaries without elaborate legal maneuvering. And she thought about the years she still had left, years she would spend alone, years where everyone would expect her to mourn appropriately for a friend, and move on. Something broke open inside her, or perhaps something finally, after 43 years, broke free. The memorial service was scheduled for Saturday at a church Dorothy had attended occasionally over the years, more for appearance than conviction. Margaret arrived early, watched as people filed in, accepted their condolences with numb detachment. "Such a good friend," they said. "You must miss her terribly." As if friendship, however deep, could encompass the magnitude of what she'd lost. Dorothy's brother had asked Margaret to say a few words. "She'd want you to," he'd said, with no awareness of the irony. Margaret had agreed, spending the days since Dorothy's death crafting and discarding speeches, trying to find words that would honor the truth without completely destroying the careful lies they had maintained. But standing in that church, looking at Dorothy's photograph displayed on an easel by the altar, Margaret found she couldn't do it, couldn't deliver another careful, coded eulogy, couldn't reduce 43 years to pleasant anecdotes about friendship and fond memories of museum visits. When they called her name, Margaret walked to the front with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. She looked out at the assembled mourners, Dorothy's colleagues, church acquaintances, distant relatives, a handful of women whose eyes held understanding. "I was asked to say a few words about Dorothy," Margaret began, her voice steady. "And I find that the words I've been given, friend, companion, close associate, are entirely inadequate. They're lies, actually, comfortable lies that we told for 43 years because the truth was dangerous." She heard the shift in the room, the subtle intake of breath. She didn't stop. "Dorothy was my partner, my love, the person I woke up next to for thousands of mornings and fell asleep beside thousands of nights. She was my wife in every way that mattered, though the law never recognized it and society never acknowledged it. We built a life together in the margins, in the spaces where we were allowed to exist." Margaret's hands trembled, but her voice grew stronger. "We hid because we had to, because in 1962, when we met, women like us lost their jobs, their families, their freedom for loving each other. We were careful because being careful meant we could stay together, and being together was worth any amount of hiding." She saw faces in the crowd, some shocked, some uncomfortable, some beginning to understand. She saw the women who already knew nodding silently. She saw Dorothy's brother, pale and rigid in the front pew. But Dorothy's last words to me were a request that I stop hiding, that I not let her be erased from my life, reduced to a footnote, diminished into something acceptable and small. So I'm standing here at 71 years old, finally telling the truth. Margaret's voice cracked, but she pushed through. "I loved her. I loved her with everything I was. She was brilliant and funny and impossibly elegant. She made me laugh every single day. She held me through losses and celebrated my victories. She was my home. And reducing that to close companion is not just inaccurate, it's a betrayal of everything we were." She looked at Dorothy's photograph, tears streaming freely now. "I know this makes some of you uncomfortable. I know it changes how you see both of us, but I spent 43 years managing other people's comfort, and I'm done. Dorothy deserves to be remembered truly, and I deserve to grieve as what I actually am, a woman who lost the love of her life." Margaret stepped down from the podium in silence. Some people were crying, others looked away. A few whispered urgently to their neighbors. She didn't care. She walked back to her seat, feeling lighter than she had in decades, feeling terrified and free in equal measure. After the service, some people left quickly, avoiding her eyes. But others approached, the women who'd understood, who lived in similar shadows. They embraced her without words. And a few others, younger people mostly, took her hand and thanked her. Dorothy's brother cornered her in the parking lot. "That was inappropriate," he said stiffly. "You had no right to—" "I had every right," Margaret interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. "I loved your sister for 43 years. You barely spoke to her for the last 20, so yes, I had every right." He left without another word. Margaret stood alone in the February cold, watching her breath cloud in the air, feeling the weight of decades lifting from her shoulders. The days that followed brought consequences. Some friends distanced themselves. The church made it clear she was no longer welcome at their coffee hour. But others reached out, people she'd never expected. An old colleague sent a note saying she'd suspected for years and admired Margaret's courage. A neighbor stopped by with groceries and a simple, "I'm sorry for your loss." Most surprisingly, Dorothy's lawyer contacted her. Apparently, Dorothy had been more careful about legal matters than Margaret had known. The main CO, Margaret lived another 19 years after Dorothy's death, years she spent openly and honestly. She became involved in LGBTQ plus advocacy work, speaking at schools and community centers about what it meant to hide and what it cost. She walked in pride parades, wearing a button with Dorothy's photograph. She answered questions from young people who couldn't imagine having to hide, and she told them, "Remember that we did. Remember that we survived. Honor it by living freely." When Margaret died at 90, her obituary told the truth. It listed Dorothy as her partner of 43 years. It mentioned their cottage in Maine, their shared life, their love. And in her will, Margaret left everything to an organization supporting LGBTQ plus elders, particularly those who'd spent decades hiding. "For everyone still living in shadow," she wrote, "may you find your way to light." If this story moved you, share it. Somewhere, someone needs to know that it's never too late to stop hiding. That truth, however difficult, is worth speaking. That love, any love, deserves to be honored, not erased. Tell your truth, honor your love, live freely,